after looking at a little over 100 examples over the last couple of years of how the church as an organization processes information and how we begin to decision-making cycle that takes place with the status quo at the church. So these yellow cards you can't quite see are what appear to be the root causes when you're dealing with these operational cycles. The first one is misunderstanding cause and effect. Some of the things that are in here are we're chasing symptoms, we're not looking at the story, even though that's the most important thing. We're not looking at the context. We are working on different problems within the same meeting, but we don't even realize it. We're using behaviors as causes when behaviors are merely symptoms. And we're introducing contributing causes and things of that nature that are not evidence-based. So that makes the whole cause and effect very blurred and ends up with a conclusion that may or may not be factual. The next one is the obstacles to problem solving. We have a misplaced authority on the facts where we are assuming that there is only one authority when really there are two. There's the one that's appointed, who's in management typically, and then there's the one who actually does the work. And then over here we have the fundamentally flawed process structure. Procedures and process aren't necessarily written by the people who execute them. They're top down and they don't correct. We don't have a system to challenge those processes. We don't really have an ongoing continuous improvement other than the person who authored it. We don't really have any process for dealing with problems in the process itself. So therefore, we can't challenge the fact that maybe the process of working with processes is just ineffective, which it is. The last card over here is leadership by proxy and command and control. And by that I mean we have a formal leadership, of course, but there is a fair amount of this proxy activity going on where people who are not officially in charge of something just do it anyway, and we accept that. So there's not always real clear distinction in terms of responsibility and authority. That becomes fairly blurred. Command and control is where top management passes down what's to be necessarily bad if you do it the way the military does it, where they have enough resources to actually execute that much detail. But very rarely is it actually done that way. It's usually done hit and miss, and it leaves behind a wake of destruction that is not seen because the person doing the command and control has moved on to another area, not realizing the fallout has been left behind. In general, though, the leadership responsibilities are not clearly defined. Leaders are not given responsibility and authority together consistently. Those are often broken apart. Quite often, we're doing problem solving with people who are not involved directly with the problem. There's no time to challenge processes. If you try to do it before, it doesn't work. If you do it during, that doesn't work. If you do it after, that doesn't work. It goes back to this infallibility. The process is good. So we kind of locked out a mechanism to challenge the process. We've also locked out a forum to challenge the process. We have the ministry teams and we have the board of directors, but in between, the operational stuff is just staff, but no forum for working out like issues between ministry teams and staff without involving the board of directors. There used to be a council of ministries that was in there on a monthly basis, and that was really of the right spirit. But right now, there's not a forum nor a time to say, I have a problem with a process that's involved in several teams that's not working for me. These yellow cards really feed down into the two pink. These are the true root causes that are going on. One is the culture of blaming and shaming, and the other is the culture of status quo, the good old boy network. So this is called decision making, cycle of deception, case of the poisoned well. As we come down around here, the status quo convenes for reactionary problem solving. They do fact gathering, primarily though by accessing the status quo through the information filter of the stock of existing information that is at best secondhand and quite often tainted from many hand-me-downs and different sources. But very rarely do we just go out and measure something or look at something with our own eyes in terms of the people in this loop making a decision. Then we come down here to where we start doing analysis of that information, but the logic is tainted just as the information was. We just don't know what and how. So there's another loop in here, and this is a reinforcing loop that says we have factual errors beget faulty logic, and they just keep going around and around. and it gets worse and worse and worse. It gets all balled up to where it's really difficult to know if we're talking about truth, because even if we try to validate that, some of the logic in getting to discern what information is relevant may be faulty. So it's very difficult to pick this apart once it starts balling up like this. Then we come down here and we become overwhelmed with possibilities, and the focus shifts to the most tangible symptom. So we kind of forget everything about problem solving and root cause, because this got to be too complicated. We have too many possibilities. We have root cause tainted with lots of jargon and weasel words, and instead of having pure evidence-based fact-finding, we're looking at possibilities and what-ifs and contributing factors, and all this kind of garbage becomes just too much. So at some point you have to make a decision, so we focus on the symptom. We equate the symptom with the cause by naming the problem and presuming the solution is found. We had a cough, for example, so we say that's our symptom, but we're saying the cause is I have a cough. Therefore the problem is I have a cough. And the solution is to get rid of the cough. So we've taken the root cause, substituted that for the first symptom, and we've identified that as the problem and as the reason why we have the problem, and basically invert it to get the solution. That's very messed up, but it can happen because this is so confusing that it actually seems refreshing after that. And this piece right here is very important. There's almost always a big delay of either time, space, or circumstances, or all. So what happens here is we're trying to prescribe a solution that at best is just going to remedy the presenting symptom, but quite often it just simply doesn't make sense. We're going to say that we want to do something that can't physically be done. So it conflicts with reality. So either a new symptom is going to pop up, or a new symptom will emerge because what we did down here really had nothing to do with doing anything. We just went through the motions, because remember, this is all done in a conference room. This is the moment of truth. This is actually done in reality. So, and because we have this command and control top-down management style, nowhere in here do we say, does this make sense? We just take a symptom and we invert it and we say, go fix it. So at no time does this square up with reality until it gets over here, and then this is done by usually someone else, and they are given marching orders because of our command and control management style to go out and fix this using this prescribed way. And it might be like putting a triangular shaped device into a round hole, and it can't be done. So they do the best they can, but really it had nothing to do with this. And the original symptom or a new symptom is going to emerge at some point because of either the damage being done, or the lack of working on this symptom, or the fact that we never even worked on the root cause, which will cause a new symptom. So we don't really know, but almost invariably a new symptom will show up. Which means we're back to the beginning again, because now we need to reconvene to start doing problem solving because we have a new symptom. How do you deal with that? Well, you do fact gathering, and you come down here, and guess what? The facts around this are not going to be reality-based. No one's going to say this thing was completely wrong, and they certainly aren't going to equate it to the faulty logic and for cause and effect and symptoms, because the person doing this isn't even aware of that. They may say that, it didn't work and so on, and we can deal with that, but that's going to be put down here as information, not with this context. So it may mean we need to get something, a whole new piece of equipment, because we need something that will fit a triangular part as opposed to the round part, instead of just saying that we prescribed the wrong fix. So we'll end up buying something major new as we go around the cycle again, and in that case it probably will fix it because we have all new equipment. So it doesn't matter if the symptom and the problem and the solution are all the same, because it's a brand new piece of equipment. We come back up here, everything's great, and then we call it a victory because the symptom went away. If it didn't, then we just keep repeating the cycle until we essentially force that to be repaired. And eventually you'll get there. If you keep playing whack-a-mole long enough, you'll replace every part in there. Or you'll do everything there is to possibly hit the root cause. So eventually you'll get it. Even a blind pig every now and then finds feed. Now what's interesting is that if you have anything that's proactive, that's not troubleshooting, that's not reactionary, it doesn't follow the cycle. It goes out here and goes into another cycle of analysis and ideals, but never really comes back in here and doesn't come into this tank of information. It just kind of goes out and says, here is an initiative, here is a plan, here is what is the 20-year vision or a 5-year vision, but it doesn't come back and square up with reality. We don't have like a master plan and a maintenance strategy that are meshed together. We just have a vision document and reactionary troubleshooting. The two will never mesh. Now the other thing, this delay can be quite significant. It could be like a year later before we have the money or before we have the means to take action on something, or it just simply takes that long to work through the cycle. Why does it take that long? Because this delay is really another loop. It gets stuck in here for so long because we have the cause and effect analysis over here is so tainted that more often than not, I would say that we have things backwards. So we think something is causing it when really that's the effect. So we're kind of our own worst enemy, where our solutions are making things more unstable, and as we work through that analysis, we get things more and more complicated, and we do this stacking of the deck, which is essentially building a case using this information, which is partially true, partially lie, and wrapped up in all this, but we stack a deck to build a case for an agenda that's nowhere on this page. It's part of one of these plans up here that are not revealed and not correlated to this. But that can take a long time to build and kind of comes out of the woodwork and then comes up here and drives for a whole new solution that seems like it's related to this, but really, if you do a root cause analysis, it's just completely unrelated. It just depends on how we react to that moment of truth. We may declare the thing fixed just because we've been told it's fixed, or we may just sit on it for a while until it becomes really broken, and then we'll repeat the cycle. But by that time, so much time will have elapsed that people will have forgotten, and we just start the whole thing over again. But in the meantime, some other agenda got advanced by injecting into here. So it is a mess. Now, what happens when you try to fix this? Because this is a reinforcing loop with no correction. As it stands right now, these little guys spin out of control, and the big one just keeps going around and around. Now on this overlay, it gets to be a little confusing because it's hard to see with the glare and all the different cards, but all this is just yellow cards that is what I'm calling the antagonist when you bring someone in to become part of the status quo. And there's going to be a video after this one that talks about pawns, patsies, patrons, and police, which is the process by which people get churned through this. So these yellow cards are someone new who's going to join the status quo. So we're going to look at the cards in between the blues this time. The status quo convenes for reactionary problem solving. The recruit is now involved. The recruit observes factual error and attempts to challenge it right from the get-go because they're doing fact gathering and says, that doesn't make sense. The challenge is done here where we're starting to talk about logic and understanding the facts. But remember, the logic is also partially faulty. So this becomes very intertwined with the fallacious logic, which usually then is where the focus is shifted by this new person trying to unwind and unravel the logic that's being used so they can get back to their factual error. But in the meantime, this part moves fairly quickly because it spins up here, so you have new topics constantly barraging and trying to fend off the logic fallacies and look for factual errors in the information gets to be overwhelming. But we keep on pressing down here, and at that point they start finding that the process itself, that there is no way to challenge this, so they say, okay, the person says, how do we stop this and talk about the fact that we need to have a way to correct some of this stuff before moving forward. So while the status quo gets overwhelmed with all the possibilities, the new recruit has inertia set in, where they just become immobilized, essentially. Then we enter the delay phase, and the recruit at this point is in too deep, because they're trying to unwind all this and make sense of it and counter a barrage of misinformation. The recruit has to back off, because this is an infinite drain of resources in terms of the person's time and talent. The status quo reduces the status of now the uninvolved recruit to reflect the fact that they have less involvement. Then the status quo declares the project back on track with consensus, because everything was fine until these challenges came along here. But then we sat here for a long time, and what came out of that is the recruit backing off. The status quo said, thank you, we'll acknowledge that, therefore you've implied that you agree that we're on the right track now, you've done your thing. Even though probably nothing actually got verbalized, the person just got totally overwhelmed and immersed into the circular discussion. Then we move forward, and remember at this point we are implementing a solution that is symptom-based, and it's most likely not going to get the desired result. So the moment of truth comes in, and that is done outside of this realm, but it comes back as there's a problem. Now we enter the blaming and shaming. Recruit is blamed without investigation, since the process otherwise would have worked. In their eyes, the only thing that has changed since last time they've been around this loop, because they've been around this loop many, many, many times, is the yellow cards. Therefore, we don't need an investigation. We don't need to talk about this. We can make this efficient. We don't need to get involved in these massive discussions. We will just declare that it's obvious the person here misunderstood. They don't understand this stuff for whatever reason, and they'll use some of the faulty logic and some of the fallacious reasoning to come up with the right wording to say that, they were inexperienced, they were too overworked, whatever it was, but it won't be checked out, of course, with the recruit, and the recruit is essentially done for this cycle, and then we come up here and of course we repeat the main cycle where we're going to now be teaching a new symptom. The question is, what happens to the recruit? Well, they may go around again, and quite often they go around several times, but eventually either the recruit burns out, just takes his marbles and goes home, or gets wise to this. At that point, the red card up here is the trump card. The recruit is eventually thrown out of the status quo and is not allowed back in. If we look at the status quo as being here in the center, and their objective is to stay entrenched as informal power and to fend off anything that is going to challenge their informal power, in that they have control and authority over anything that they want, as long as it is not officially given to them to the point that they have accountability and responsibility for it. So the idea is to have it informally and as a status quo that everyone assumes that, but when it comes right down to it, they can't be held accountable to anything. And there is a 4-step process this can go through, and it starts with an entry phase where the status quo, through gift of gab, through their charm, through social influence, through just good people skills, are able to position themselves next to something that they want. So let's say up here that there's something they want. Perhaps it's some responsibility or some decision-making capability within the organization that they would like to be in charge of. But they're not going to ask for it directly. They want to just usurp that authority. So we start with them positioning themselves next to that, in a sense assuming that they already have it, what we'll call pawns over here. And pawns is going to be this big group of new recruits, new people into the organization, either congregants or employees or members, and what they have in common with each other is that they need support and they want to really do a good job. Up here we have the patrons, and the patrons are going to be those people who do have the formal power, their high-level organization, their management, their leadership, and they also need support and they want to please, but they've also been around a while and already have that formal power. The cycle starts with step 1 over here. I'm just going to put a 1. And step 1 is going to be the assessment phase. So the assessment phase is where the status quo takes a look at the pawns and begins to identify targets, or begins to identify people in the pawn group that are able to recruit into the status quo. And they need to have people who understand the details behind the things that they can't have directly. So whatever it is up here that they want, they need to find people over here who are associated with that, or who have those types of skills, and then lure them into the status quo. And they do this by offering help and by offering support, the very things that the pawns want. And then they give them very positive feedback from a social standpoint that they're doing well. But of course they do that only when they are doing the things that the status quo wants them to do. So that's the beginning of the next phase. But they assess who is going to be in that position to be able to be manipulated and controlled, and to give the status quo what it is that they want to get to this. At the same time, they are building a rapport up here, and it looks like a two-way street at this point, with the patrons, so that they essentially are buddy-buddy with them, saying that we're in this together and I'm here to help, but in this case, more as a peer, as I'm here to help take things off your plate that you don't want on your plate. So we're going to start stacking the deck by saying that something about this up here is going to be more undesirable than it perhaps should be. So like anything, there's going to be good things and bad things of any job, of any responsibility, but this assessment and this building of a rapport is going to start stacking the deck to make this look undesirable to the patron, therefore something they're going to want to give up. And that's where we're into phase 2, which is the manipulation phase, and that's done over a great deal of time. I'm going to put a big old line down here and call it time, because it takes place over a lot of time, a lot of circumstances, and changing of roles. There may be some turnover of other patrons up here, other leaders and management, and the pawns will come and go, so that there will not be a lot of continuity in terms of what all happened. So during this time, this is going to be looking less and less favorable, and we're going to get the pawn to do the things that are necessary to get the status quo closer to this. So basically just getting things out of them. And the way that is done is by spreading disinformation, both positive and negative. So they're going to put all sorts of disinformation into the organization throughout this time that is positive about themselves and negative about the pawns and the patron as it relates to this target over here. Okay? And as that's done, at various times when opportunity arises, they're going to introduce conflict. So when something comes up where perhaps there is a policy issue or something going on with this, and this person just kind of has a headache about it, and this person's eager to help, then the status quo will flip-flop and introduce something that's going to be divisive, although it doesn't look that way, because they're going to introduce it only to this person and up here in a very limited way, only to show the part that is something that they don't want to deal with. So they kind of put on a positive spin saying, this is really icky, wouldn't you like to have some help with that? And over here, they're not talking to everybody involved, but just to the one. And the whole purpose of this would be to create a conflict, to basically lay the groundwork or lay the seeds for a conflict to occur, which then will occur shortly thereafter because something is going to collide. But it looks then like the collision is between here and not where it actually originated from with the status quo. So that's the whole point of the manipulation phase, is to have a stacking of the deck or building cases so that this conflict can occur. And another way to do it from an information standpoint is poisoning the well, where you're basically saying the well of truth or the well of factual information has been poisoned, and no one realizes it because it's been done for such a long time that whenever they go back to look at facts or whatever, they don't realize that they're looking at misinformation, because again, positive misinformation was spread about the status quo and negative misinformation was spread about everyone else. So it's a perfect setup for the next phase 3, which is the confrontation phase. And the confrontation is really between the patron and the pawn having a conflict. And it's going to come down to anything but facts, because again, this wasn't based in facts, and it was all set up to do with character, with misinformation, with personalities, things of that nature. So what you end up with is essentially a character assassination, a framing. It's kind of him against her kind of deal, and they're going to talk about facts to support that, but the facts will come out of this poisoned well. So they're not even aware that the facts have been tainted because they don't dig into the facts, they don't look at it. So in a sense, reality kind of sits down here, that is readily available, but nobody goes down and tests things that seem obvious, that seem so plausible that you wouldn't question them. But they would take maybe minutes just to validate, to see if what this person's saying and what this person's saying is really what they said, for example, as opposed to just assuming that because they've been told that through here, and then through some kind of passive affirmation that they think is what they did say, that's what they'll go with, as opposed to coming down here and validating reality. We'll just assume that it's true so we don't hurt people's feelings, which of course then hurts people's feelings. So the reality kind of stays down here, insulated, just a few footsteps away from ever being looked at directly. And the confrontation then swells. But interestingly enough, the status quo is no longer part of the confrontation. It's taking place between the pawn and the patron. And someone's going to have to win, because at this point it is a confrontation. And what typically is going to happen is the pawn is going to lose, because the pawn was set up to lose, because they're dispensable. There's a whole pool of them here. There's only so many patrons up here. To bring in the other role, and that would be the patsy role. And that's this big pool that is the pawns that have been discarded out of the status quo. So their entire intention was just to be gobbled up, and when their usefulness has been consumed, then they get tossed out as patsies. And interestingly enough, because of all this disinformation taking place over time, that when this does take place, no one questions it, because there's been a character assassination. There has been a framing. The facts have been twisted so much that no one's actually going to challenge that. And in fact, if it does get challenged, it'll get challenged to the patron, and the patron is most likely going to affirm what took place, because all the facts seem to point that this should have taken place. And they'll just make sure that the pawn gets consumed and goes into the patsy used up pool. And this becomes this heavily trafficked path, as pawns are consumed one after another, where the pawn gets pushed into the patsy role, and the patron does the pushing, and in a sense elevates the status quo, saying that this is something that the status quo needs to help resolve. So up here we have this storm that has now taken place, that's far apart from reality, but it's also just one step away from actually being looked at. We're not going to go up here and see, well, what is this storm all about? What was this conflict about? We never get there, because again, the deck has been stacked over time to make us think that it is factually based. So there's no reason to challenge something that is obvious as a storm that's looming overhead. We would say it just is there, therefore it is factual. But the reality is, if we just went up there and tested it and looked at it for a few minutes, we'd find out that it was a fabrication, and it's just a smoke screen there for obstruction purposes. But it just stays up there. Reality kind of stays down here, and we operate right in between, which is exactly where the status quo likes to operate and must operate. It has to always operate below the storm they created and above the reality that will expose them. The confrontation phase then goes into the inevitable fourth phase, which is the Ascension Phase, where now that the pawn is gone and the blame will be placed on them as they become a patsy, the patron thinks this is just nothing but a big old headache and they want to be rid of it, they will willfully negotiate it away. So they're going to give it to the status quo, whatever this responsibility and authority is. But they can't formally give it, because that's their job, but they will informally give them complete authority from a practical standpoint to the status quo to make this go away. And guess what? It goes away because it was never there to begin with. It was something that was fabricated and twisted to become more negative than it needed to be, and the confrontation surrounding it was cooked up by the status quo. The patron doesn't see it that way. The patron sees it as a rescue, as something that has been taken off their plate. Life has been made better. It's a win-win from their standpoint. That now begins the cycle again, because as this person ascends into having more usurped authority, there's nothing to prevent them from starting again and finding something over here that they want. Which is exactly what they'll do. And they'll find alliances over to pawns that will get them there, and they'll build up those relationships, they'll consume them into the patsies, and they will create the conflict, and this entire cycle will repeat over and over again as little by little more and more power is assumed by the status quo. But nothing can be proven, because the reality is the patrons still have all the authority. Nothing has changed officially, and the storm that is the fear behind all of this, the storm looms intensely. The only thing standing between us and sheer chaos is the status quo. And that's what we are led to believe, status quo, which is the exact opposite of the reality of what occurred and what the facts would support if we would look at the reality and the storm independent of this dynamic here in the middle. The dynamic in the middle is nothing but a construct to deceive. Nothing more, nothing less, and it should be treated as such. The last is the police. And there's always going to be police somewhere, and they would typically be like an outside auditor. It would be someone who can see through manipulation. It would be somebody who has that type of job experience. Those people exist. They're just far and few in between in a nonprofit organization. And they are kept down here, far, far from ever entering into this equation, because all they have to do to square all this up is to get back to reality. That's really all has to happen earlier in this phase. If this starts repeating over and over, the gaslighting takes place to where the reality is harder and harder to find, because it has been so abstracted away by so many layers of lies and so much deception that you can't even find reality after a while. But if this cycle is just starting, it doesn't take much to have this be exposed by just looking at the reality, and that's what the police would do, but not if they don't get the chance to do that. So the status quo is going to identify people who have this potential to see through manipulation and to see through this game, and they're going to keep them far away. So that was the other part of this assessment phase, is they're going to kick out any police potential, and they're going to keep them far away from this pool, and certainly are not going to invite them into the status quo, and they're going to keep them far away by distance and by discrediting them from an offensive standpoint. The best defense is an offense, so right from the get-go, they're going to find 10,000 reasons why these people should not become anywhere in this equation, and they'll keep them at bay from the get-go. We're all perfectly willing to discredit the police with what we think is the truth.